Hi, everyone. So this is the second part of my Unit 22 summary. It will be a very, very short part because I didn't intend to make two parts, but little puppy issue last night meant that I had to pause the video and stop there. So this last part of the video is just going to be about why governments might fail. So we kind of said early on in the first video that the objectives of government might typically be about trying to kind of correct some sort of market failure. So if there's some sort of Pareto inefficiency in some market in the economy, or that there is some perceived unfairness, right? The sharing out of the pie is not been done in an equitable enough fashion. So for governments to kind of implement a policy that will fix one of these things, it's only going to happen if three things are true. If it's actually economically feasible, right? So if the policy will actually achieve what the goal is, if it's administratively feasible, if the government can actually has the ability to actually implement the policy, and then finally, and really interesting that we're kind of thinking about this, if special interests allow it, right? So if those people who control government policy, to say, the party who are in power, if they actually want to see the policy implemented, if it doesn't say go against particularly influential financial donors or something like that. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is circumstances in which these things, particularly the first, the economic feasibility and the special interest, why these things might not allow a policy to be put in place. And I'll come back and talk about administrative feasibility very, very briefly. So a good example of why a policy might not be economically feasible in the sense that you get consequences that you didn't intend that actually have made things worse, hence government failure, is what if a government bring in a policy of providing a more generous unemployment benefit, but they're going to finance that more generous unemployment benefit by increasing or potentially putting a tax on the profits of companies, right? So maybe they're increasing the tax on profits. So how do we analyze the impact of these two policies? So I suppose you could say it's a single policy, but what's the impact going to be? Well, the most appropriate model to use is our labor market model. As you can see here, we've got price setting curves, wage setting curves. So the first and the kind of initial impact of this policy, this more generous unemployment benefit, is we would see the wage setting curve shift up to this higher position. So what does that indicate? It indicates that at every level of employment, workers would now demand a higher post-tax real wage in order to put in effort and actually work. So that's impact number one. Okay. Let me clear that. Now, the second impact is going to be due to how this is financed, a tax on profits. So where is this going to have an impact on our labor market? Well, on the firms, right? And what we should think about is a tax on profits is essentially an extra cost to the firms. So remember, the price setting curve is a real wage. It's a real wage level. And so by real wage level, we mean the nominal wage that they offer to the workers divided by capital P, the price level. So if there's a tax on profits or an increased tax on profits introduced, then from the firm's perspective, if the level of competition that they see in their goods market has unchanged, well, how they're going to respond to that is by increasing price, right? They're going to increase the price level to try and maintain the same markup that they had before. Their costs go up and they pass it on completely to consumers. So that means that price level's gone up and the nominal wage, I know we have this sort of higher wage setting curve, but we're kind of assuming that's happened already. So we had this higher nominal wage, but and then the firms do two things, right? They respond to the higher nominal wage they have to pay and the higher tax on profits. Both of those things get the firms to increase their prices. And that, therefore, is going to lead to the real wage actually falling. And we're going to end up with a price setting curve, a new price setting curve, which is now lower. And so what's the overall consequence of this, right? Well, the overall consequence is we started off at this equilibrium, okay, where workers were getting this real wage, there was this level of employment here. And although it's quite dramatic in this diagram, our new equilibrium after workers have had this more generous unemployment benefit offer and firms are facing this tax on profits to finance it, we actually end up at a new equilibrium where workers, those in work, are getting a lower real wage, and we actually see a lower level of employment. Now, the people who are unemployed, and there are now a lot more of them, are getting more generous unemployment benefit, but surely this is not something that a government would want to happen, right? You don't want to implement a policy that actually is going to lead to those in work having lower real wages and actually more unemployment. So that's a good example of a policy which is economically probably not feasible because it's got these unintended consequences which kind of, I wouldn't say they go against what the policy is designed to do. Like it's designed to have more generous unemployment benefit. You'd assume in order to give those people who are unemployed a greater share in the pie, but the kind of unintended consequences are higher unemployment and a lower real wage for those in work, which are really not good outcomes. So that's an example of where a policy is maybe not economically feasible. To go back to a second for the administratively feasible. So why would a policy not be administratively feasible? Typically, because the government lacks information, right? The government lacks enough information to actually implement the policy in the way that they intend to. And that's typically the reason why a policy would be administratively infeasible, that lack of information, or there could be asymmetric information or imperfect information. So then the final thing is special interests. So where we can kind of bring in an economic slant into this is to think about, well, why are special interests kind of involved? Why might certain groups of people influence government policy? And the way we can bring the economic slant is to realize that in a democracy, I should stress that, not just with any form of government, but particularly with a democracy, we can think of government as a principal agent problem, where, as you can see, the government officials, that could be in the UK, the members of parliament, the civil service who do what the members of parliament ask them to do, are the agents, right? They are acting out, they are trying to do what the principals, which is the citizens of the country, are asking them to do. So we actually we can think about government as a principal agent problem. But then you see we've got these two questions, right? So why would the elected officials actually do what the principals, do what the citizens desire, right? Now, we can see in a democratic system, elections maybe provide one of those reasons. But, in the dictatorship types that we considered before, maybe this like certainly wouldn't be the case. The agents would really not necessarily want to carry out what the principals want. And then this is, I think, really where this idea of special interests come in. So the principals here are the citizens, right? The people in general. But within that, there are so many different principles, so many different citizens who have different priorities for what the government should actually do. So how is it that the agents, the government, kind of actually know what it is they should be doing? Because there's so many broad things that principals, all these citizens want them to actually do. So this is how, so what I'll talk about now is how we have certain systems in a lot of democratic countries in order to try to, I suppose, solve this principal agent problem, to align the actions of the agents with the desires of the principals. So just a brief little aside, we have the same problem with employees and employers, right? And if we think about the ways in which that can be solved, that we can kind of try and, like, recognizing that there can't be a complete contract, how do we then try to get the workers, how do the employers get the employees to do what they want them to do? Well, three different methods, right? You can pay the agent an economic rent, right? As in pay them a high enough wage to encourage them to put in effort. And the the alternative, if they don't, is that they will lose the job. And so that employment rent, that economic rent, encourages them to do what you want them to do, to put in that effort. You could also monitor the work of the employee, right? So make it like harder for them to shirk, to not put the effort in. And there's also the risk of, if they don't put in the necessary effort, they can be replaced, right? So really, really similar things in a democratic government. The first, give the official, so the member of parliament, the member of the House of Representatives, give them a salary that's so sufficient, so high enough, and also that they have prestige associated with the position of being an elected official and other amenities of office. I don't know, maybe like a private car, things like that. But make it so that there is again, like an economic rent to encourage them to want to keep this position as an elected official. Then monitor. Absolutely, we monitor the activities of governments. So you've got a few things. Transparency, right? So government business has to be very, like, everything so that the public can see what's going on. We have free press, so that different media organizations can report on what the government's doing, free speech, so the government can't stop people expressing particular views. And then I'll just touch on this for a second, judicial review. So that might be a term people haven't come across before. It's this idea that if the government makes a decision, and that's at all levels, then people, like anybody, can actually challenge that decision in a court, right? And then it will be up to them to make a case to a judge, and then the judge will maybe rule and say, oh, actually, what the government's doing here kind of goes against the law, and it could be overturned. And so these are all ways of monitoring what the government's doing, again, to kind of make sure that it aligns with the interests of the principles of the citizens. And then the final thing, this idea of replacing workers with other workers, right? We do that in a democratic country. We have periodic elections, right? So that there is a chance for the principals, the citizens, to replace the agents, to replace the government officials if they're not happy with their performance. So that's how we can think of this, like, issue of special interests, and how we can think of it as a principal agent problem, and ways that it can be kind of, I don't want to say solved, but ways that we can improve the performance of government in a democracy. However, I've got to finish on a bit of a sad note, to be honest, which is that these solutions to the principal agent problem of government, they come with a big downside, which is that, and in particular, because of this being subject to periodic review, right? Particularly elections, in the UK, elections every 5 years, roughly. In the US, in some instances, elections every 2 years for members of the House of Representatives, or 4 years for the president. These periodic elections will encourage governments it gives them an incentive to undertake projects that will be very visible, that will happen, that the outcomes will happen soon and quickly. And so that will encourage the elected officials to be very short-termist in their thinking. And solving that problem is one that I'm not sure many countries have managed to achieve. That there just has been a tendency in democratic countries to really go for short-term policies. Although an interesting thing is mentioned, that if an elected official does not face a periodic election because maybe there's a term limit, right? So they cannot stand again. That might be a little bit the answer to this, that in that period where they know I don't have to face an election in future, I can now do maybe the long-term things. So that's a possible thing. Term limits could be a possible solution. Okay, so sorry I had to split this up into 2 videos. I hope it's not too much of a pain, but that is it for my summary for Unit 22. As always, I hope it was helpful, and yeah, I'll leave it there.